I moved to Istanbul in 2010. I was the stringer for the Times of London and various other publications for about 7 years. My book is I'm slightly nervous speaking to this audience because most of the people I've spoken to about the book, I've assumed quite a low level of knowledge about Turkey. And here I'm very aware that there's probably quite a high level of knowledge, and the book has a lots of different things in it. That there's some sort of anthropology, I guess you'd say. There's some journalism, there's some history, but I'm not an academic or a historian or an anthropologist or a sort of expert. So I'm sure hopefully there'll be something in it for everyone though. So I'll start with the name of the book, as many of you know, To the City is a reference to the origin of the name Istanbul. Istanbul, which is derived from the Greek. It's a demotic Greek, either the city or to the city. It's often said, and there's this perhaps slightly fanciful idea that people were always arriving there, and so asking where they were going and saying to the city or something like that, which is probably a bit fanciful, but to me it sort of captured this sense of Istanbul as a place that's continually drawn people into itself and continually renewed itself. And it's a book about kind of decline and renewal, I guess. And so I arrived to the city in 2010. It was complete sort of chance, really, because I didn't know about Turkey. I'd never been to Turkey before. I was working on a local newspaper in Crawley in Sussex, and was doing shifts on foreign desk at the Times as a researcher. And I knew I wanted to go abroad and get into foreign correspondence. And I got in the car at work one day and switched on the radio, and it was the middle of a program. And when you switch on halfway into a radio show and you don't know the key information of the place they're talking about. So they were describing a neighborhood somewhere and the food and the nightlife and the music and that sort of stuff. And I was like, wow, where's this? And then finally at the end they said Istanbul, and I thought maybe that's where I should go. And so I spoke to the Times at the foreign desk, and they said, well, actually our correspondent happens to be leaving soon. So they said, if you go there, you can pitch to us and we'll see how it goes. So that's what I did. I arrived with having done some sort of frantic reading and tried to do some language courses and stuff, but really in retrospect with shamefully little knowledge. But it ended up working out okay, and I was sort of in the right place at the right time. But it was a very interesting time to have arrived in Turkey, because it was at that time, it was, hold on, my thing isn't working now. Why isn't that going? Yeah, at that time, it was 2010, and Istanbul was the European capital of culture. And I remember there being this kind of atmosphere there where there was still quite a lot of optimism about Erdogan and the AKP. The Turkey had recovered very well from the financial crisis. It was posting sort of double-digit growth. There was a sort of economic team who were all kind of vetted in Western brokerages and that sort of thing. And then Turkey's EU membership didn't quite seem completely dead yet. EU membership bid, and there was also this Kurdish opening going on, a sort of peace opening towards solving the Kurdish issue, which was quite unprecedented, and there was a lot of optimism around that. And you had also sort of outreaches towards the some of the minority communities in Turkey. So this was a picture I took in 2010 at Akdamar Island in Lake Van, where the government had sort of funded the restoration of an old Armenian church there, and then held a mass. And some of this was perhaps sort of window dressing, but at the time it seemed to send this message that Turkey was evolving in a direction of enhancing at least religious freedoms or sort of social freedoms on different fronts. and then this was a picture I took at Nevers, I think the following March, which as anyone would see now, you wouldn't see something like this, of the sort of Kurdish language displayed so openly, sort of hundreds of thousands of people celebrating Kurdish New Year. So there was this sense of optimism, and really over the course of the time that I was living in Turkey, you know, I'd arrived just at the summit or perhaps after the summit, and it was really that there was this very steady, quite dramatic decline on almost all of these fronts. You know, this Kurdish peace process collapsed, and you know, terrible fighting in the southeast that devastated many cities, including the old historic centre of Diyarbakir. And there was an erosion of democracy and the free media and civil rights. And then you had, you know, the Syrian civil war, which erupted on Turkey's doorstep and brought with it all kinds of social and political problems as well. And then, you know, capping this, you had the coup attempt of 2016, and also the sort of economic collapse, which people are obviously very familiar with, which has brought us, you know, sky high inflation for more than 2 years now. Initially, you know, I'd felt quite sort of insulated from all of this as a foreigner living there, reporting on it. You know, I felt like I was, you know, in a foreign country, and this was all upsetting and interesting. But over time, it began to feel more and more personal. You know, I married into a Turkish family. I began to have friends and colleagues who were being kicked out of the country or in prison, and also there was this other sense that the politics that we were seeing in Turkey, this sort of rise of right-wing populist authoritarianism, was becoming a kind of a global trend, and that you know, this wasn't something that was quite so far from home, in fact. What's all this got to do with the walls? So I first walked along the walls in the land walls in I think 2012, and I was just immensely struck by them as this incredibly sort of atmospheric part of the city, and they, you know, they made a very deep impression on me, and it seemed to me that they captured something about Istanbul's character. You know, you have this sense of a sort of deep and momentous history that has placed the city at the sort of centre of world events, and I think I would almost liken it to the kind of atmosphere that you would get in Jerusalem or Rome. But the key difference with Istanbul is that Istanbul is also at the same time this sprawling urban megacity, which has grown, you know, stratospherically in the last 70 years, from something like 2 million people in 1960 to, you know, between 16 and 20 million today. And so, you know, you have this sense there of a place which is both has this momentous past looming in its background, and this sort of onrushing future that's always coming at it, and at the same time is both kind of extraordinary and vital in its own present. And so for me, the walls captured that because they both seem to be something that's sort of stuck there out of time. I like this old picture, which I think is from the 1890s or something. You can see there's a Greek funeral happening in the foreground, because, you know, they show how they were back before they were all sort of built up around them, and they sort of capture that sense of sort of decaying grandeur. But so just to, you know, say a bit about the walls themselves, they're 4 miles long. You know, you have this sort of 3-part structure of the inner wall, which in this picture has you can just see the towers there. The actual wall bit has largely collapsed, and then the outer wall, which is sort of a line in front, and then the moat. And so the whole thing is about 200 feet from the outside of the moat to the inside of the inner wall. So within the city, they're such a large structure that they almost seem more sort of geological than architectural. They were built in at the beginning of the 5th century during the reign of the Emperor Theodosius II. Initially, it's thought that there was one sort of circuit of walls built during his sort of childhood, and then later in the century, after an earthquake, there were these very, very rapid repair and expansion of the walls was made. After which they had their sort of basic character that they then had thereafter, and there are several inscriptions on the walls which commemorate this fact and which say that this repair, this construction, or it's called a construction, but they believe it was sort of a repair and expansion after an earthquake. It was done in the space of 60 days, which seems incredible, but which the sources are quite sort of insistent on it, and if it is true, which historians seem to sort of entertain that it could well be true, it's a reflection of the context in which they were built, because this was the time of the barbarian invasions. Attila the Hun was ravaging through the Balkans and through the wider region, and the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. So there was very much this sense of existential threat, but at the same time, Constantinople itself was thriving, and it was, the Eastern Roman Empire had become this very powerful state, and so they pulled off the kind of extraordinary achievement that a powerful organized state can do when it feels its back is against the wall. And so I found that sort of context very interesting, and they were one of the great architectural marvels of their day. They protected the city for 1,000 years, so about 20 sieges. The Arabs, Bulgars, Persians, Slavs, Russians, and the Ottoman Turks and others. The only time Constantinople was taken by force, during those 1,000 years, before Mehmet, was by the Fourth Crusade, who used sort of Venetian sea power to essentially get into the Golden Horn and take the city by the sea walls. So, the land walls had a sort of fairly good record. And so then, on the other side, you had Mehmet, who I like this medallion picture of him, because this is one of the sort of few likenesses we have of him in his youth, when he was, 21 years old when he captured Constantinople, and you have a sort of sense of what he might have looked like as a young man there. What he achieved in capturing the city, obviously by that point, Constantinople had become an impoverished city-state. It was surrounded entirely by almost entirely by Ottoman territory, and its fall looks inevitable in the long scheme of things. But at the time, this was still a massive undertaking, and its success was far from certain. There were many people around him who were counselling him not to attempt it. He achieved in his use of cannons a similar kind of extraordinary accomplishment to the construction of the walls themselves. It required a massive marshalling of manpower. It required him to get saltpeter from Belgrade, and sulfur from Van, and bronze from various places, and tin, and the carving and transportation of huge cannonballs, and then the whole creation and dragging of the cannon. This was something which only a very large, powerful state could achieve. And whereas the walls were built, as a protective thing, this was built through a sort of sense of reaching for something new. And Mehmet was a great fan of, very interested in engineering and innovation, and so I found that context in the siege very interesting. And then lastly, of course, this history, the history connected with the walls, is very current in Turkey today. So this is a picture of the Panorama 1453 museum, which is very close to the city walls, and was opened in the AKP era. And 1453 has always been a sort of foundational part of Turkish identity, but over time it's become increasingly prominent. And in the early Republican era, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Ottoman history was often, or especially the late Ottoman history, was often sort of denigrated and talked down, and it's sort of minimized in terms of its significance for modern Turkish identity. But really, over the course of the 20th century and then now the 21st century, this has changed. And one of the big moments in that process was the 500th anniversary of the siege in 1953, which happened to be when Adnan Menderes was the prime minister, and he was rolling back some of the harsher Kemalist reforms, and celebrating the siege was obviously something that was important at that time, and the siege has only become more important in terms of Turkish, in terms of its, I guess, political exploitation in the time since. And really, this process has had its apotheosis under Erdogan. I'll just move this so you can see. So this is him praying in the Hagia Sophia after its reconversion back to a mosque in 2020. And he's often framed his kind of social and cultural mission in terms of a reconquest, and he frequently has invoked the conquest of Constantinople. Because he sort of tended to see the Kemalist project as sort of quasi-colonial, this sort of attempt to import, as he sees it, a Western culture, sort of foreign Western culture into Turkey. And he sees himself as rolling that back. Obviously, it's a vision which is both sort of, in which Turkey is both a sort of post-colonial victim, but also a sort of a post-imperial great power seeking to kind of re-establish itself. There were all these resonances. I mean, one other thing that very much struck me when I was walking around the walls was how, so I took this picture probably about 150 meters from the Panorama 1453 exhibition, and this was in the sort of intramural zone, between the inner and outer wall by the fourth military gate. This is the sort of broken portal of the fourth military gate, and there, right next to it, there were a couple of cannonballs, which presumably were fired at the siege and have been there ever since. They were recently unearthed, but when I took this picture, which was probably about 2015, there was no one there. They weren't protected in any way. It was a very dangerous place to go because it's quite full of drug addicts, and it's not a safe place. In fact, when I tried to go back there about 4 or 5 months ago, I actually couldn't get in there because there were probably about 20 very, very threatening looking guys just wandering around. So there's this extraordinary kind of exploitation and sort of almost Disneyfication of history on the one hand, but on the other, there's this sort of striking neglect of the actual fabric of history, of Turkey's historical heritage, and you see the same thing with these old neighborhoods of Ottoman houses, which are sometimes knocked down and then rebuilt sort of in pastiche, and obviously, on the one hand, with regards to the walls, that neglect is very striking, with regards to the walls, that neglect is very striking, and on the one hand, there's throughout Turkish Republican history, there's been this sort of denigration of what's sometimes seen as foreign heritage, the non-Muslim, especially Christian, Greek, Armenian heritage. And so on the one hand, you might think the walls fall into that. But on the other hand, they are this sort of extraordinary stage on which the Turkish sort of national was the stage of this massive victory. I mean, I think the reason for the neglect is rather more mundane in that they're a vast area. restoring them is an extremely expensive process that requires a sustained vision on part of the city authorities over a long period of time, which Istanbul hasn't really had. And also they're not that easy to monetize, really. So I think there are various reasons why they're in the state of neglect they're in. This is I say all this to say some of the things which got me interested in the walls and which gave me the idea of writing a book about the walls. And initially I thought that I would write an essay, and then when I started walking along them and seeing some of the communities there, I sort of realized there's such diversity and there's so much there that I thought, no, this could be a book. And obviously I was thinking of writing a collection of essays on different subjects, and obviously a book is rather easier to sell to an editor than a collection of essays. And I just thought there was so much about the walls that could be so many different connections and links to Turkey today and in the past that I thought I should just focus on them. And also seeing the different communities, the Kurdish communities, Alevi communities, the sort of Syrian migrant communities, and the Black Sea communities, and all these different groups living around the walls. I kind of thought I could do a portrait of Istanbul and a sort of portrait of Turkey through writing about them. That juxtaposition that I drew between, on the one hand, the force of the walls as being this structure created to preserve an old order against destruction, and then on the other hand, Mehmet's use of relatively new cannon technology as this sort of disruptive, innovative force seeking to change the world. That, I guess, thematically informed the book, in the sense that through my time in Turkey, I described the kind of political changes I saw, but at the same time there were also extraordinary changes in the fabric of the city, which I think anyone who visits Istanbul in a periodic way is very aware of, the speed at which it changes. It's funny the way in Britain, we sort of struggle to build one train line over the course of about 15 years, and in Turkey they have the opposite problem. But and also the environmental changes that we've all seen happening around us, in the city and around the city through that time. So I wanted to look at how the people living around the city were experiencing and coping with these changes. So one thing which I felt strongly about was that I'd worked in Istanbul as a foreign correspondent, and I found that doing that job, you have to very quickly get your head around the politics and the different social trends, and you talk to experts and you talk to other journalists and you follow the news and you try to get to grips with everything. And then when you're writing stories, you tend to go out and look for people who seem to illustrate, what you've identified as being the key issues, or what your editors, believe the key issues. And I found that as I got to know Turkey better, and as I began to feel more sort of intimate with Turkey as a country, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the sort of tone of authority that you're expected to project as a foreign correspondent. And especially I found that that there were several events in Turkish, while I was there, that I felt very wrapped up in, and I kind of thought, like, I want to do something more personal, but I also want to do something which is yeah. I mean, the thought that I had at one point was that I would feel far less confident and comfortable pronouncing on English society and politics than I would feel pronouncing on Turkish society and politics. And I kind of thought maybe it's because I know English politics less well, which is true. But then I think it's also just because the better you know a culture and the better you're within it, the more reticent you are to sort of categorize people and at least I felt like that anyway. I felt more and more uncomfortable. So I decided to approach the book in the sense of going around and finding people who I found personally sympathetic, like likable people who clearly had stories to tell, and then just see, from across the political spectrum, and then just see where their stories led. And so I followed some of these people for about 4 or 5 years, I guess. And whatever ideas and themes I had that I wanted to write about, I wanted to sort of put these stories first. And so this is one of these guys. This is one of the first people I spoke to, who was this man called Ismet Hazer, who lived in this neighborhood called Toplu, which is right at one end of the walls by the Golden Horn. So his neighborhood was being redeveloped as part of an urban renewal project, and everyone had been bought out or forced out in different ways, and he was absolutely the last stubborn holdout who refused to leave. And at one point, he'd been reported in the papers that he'd tried to kill himself by drinking agricultural pesticide, and he'd written a suicide note to sort of blaming everyone from the sort of the Istanbul mayor, the Fatih mayor, like up to Erdogan for driving him to suicide through sort of taking his home away. He recovered, and then he carried on fighting, and so this is his house, but this is an example of the kind of spirit that he had in terms of fighting to retain his home. And it also, this picture sort of sums up, as I see it, this sort of people's stubbornness in holding on to what their lives and what they have in face of these relentless forces of change. And they sort of rather captures the spirit of what I saw, around the walls and what sort of drew me to the walls. So yeah, as so I weave these things in with really the story of what happened, the major developments that happened in Turkey while I was living there. The first of these was obviously the Gezi Park protests. A lot of you will probably recognize this picture, the woman in the red dress, Jada Sungur. And it was this sort of pivotal moment in the protests, which had hitherto been quite small, where this picture went viral, and it was so sort of striking how completely inoffensive she was, how completely, there's no possible way you could interpret, this as being a sort of a violent radical or anything. And it was one of those moments that accelerated the protests. I found that, it's the first big event that I go back to and discuss in the book, because it was very formative in my own view of Turkey, because I found that you saw these different political groups, on the far right, the kind of grey wolves, MHP types, and then you had protesting alongside their sort of polar opposite. On the left you had the Kurdish HDP, I don't know, BDP, I think it was then, and the sort of far left groups, and they were all protesting together, and there was this extraordinary sense that things which had seemed kind of impossible in terms of things that had seemed politically impossible in Turkey might have seemed for a moment to be possible. And you also had at that time this initially quite conciliatory messages coming from some of the more senior figures in the AKP, like Bülent Arınç and Abdullah Gül and people like that. And there was this brief sense that perhaps the sort of polarization that you were seeing growing in Turkey could be arrested, and that something positive could have come out of this. And as we all know, that that didn't happen, and Erdogan returned from his trip to North Africa, where he was during the protests, and and for me, it was a very painful moment, because it was when I kind of felt like my sort of some of the naive optimism that I'd sort of carried through from arriving in Turkey was really sort of crushed that day. And it also made me reflect on how you know, how there was also this whole other section of society which viewed these protests in a completely different way, in terms of, you know, the vandalism and all this sort of stuff, and the calls for Erdogan to resign, and that there was this whole other section of society which didn't see them as this uniting thing, but as this thing that was pulling society apart. And I kind of that experience very much informed how I approached the book, in that I wanted to sort of strike a balance between acknowledging the you know, the growing injustices being carried out by Erdogan's government, and but also to show the perspective of the people who follow him, and the way in which their perspective is perfectly reasonable from where they stand. You know, one of the women I talked to in the book, who's a covered woman, and she was saying how you know, initially when the protest began, she was quite supportive of them, but then she was walking down the street at night one night, and you know, there were people were banging their pots and pans, and she said how one woman looking out of her window had very deliberately started banging her pots in her direction. And it's, you know, it's a story that to me is completely plausible, and you can completely see how that would be an incredibly alienating experience. But so the other thing, of course, which, you know, the Gezi protests sort of drew me onto, that was the sort of celebration and the letting off of flares on the last night before the police moved in, which was a pretty extraordinary, sort of wonderful moment. But of course, the other issue which the Gezi protests, you know, were motivated by, is the environmental issues surrounding the city, and the you know, the destruction of green space, and here, you know, the creation of the third bridge over the Bosphorus. Obviously, the first two bridges were, well, especially the second bridge was created to relieve traffic, but obviously had completely the opposite effect, and led to massive urban sprawl. When he was mayor of Istanbul, Erdogan had opposed this project, but then, you know, as prime minister, you know, he pushed it through, and you know, the result of that, along with you know, other infrastructure projects, has been this very dramatic destruction of the forest around Istanbul. And one of my favorite sort of so one of the things that I found so interesting in Turkey was the way in which the sort of clash between development and the natural world is so kind of lurid. One of my favorite statistics about Istanbul is that the province of Istanbul alone has more endemic plant species than the whole of the UK. And so, you know, the stakes are very high. There's extraordinary biodiversity in Turkey. There's and even just in Istanbul, and then the rate of development is so fast. So I sort of touch on this in the book as well. And there's one, you know, particular project which, for me, was sort of emblematic of so many of the different trends going on in Turkey, and especially the way in which the construction industry and politics work together, and the way in which, you know, the Erdogan government uses construction as a way of underpinning its political power. I mean, so this is the site that would become the third airport. Oh, sorry, I call it the third. Sorry, not third airport. The new airport, I guess. And I remember visiting this area in I think 2012 or something, before construction began. And I was with a farmer, and he pointed out to me basically the horizon, and said, yeah, the airport's going to go all the way from where we're standing now to the horizon. and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't completely virgin land. There were some old mines and stuff there, but it was basically forests and lakes and fields, and it was completely incomprehensible to me at the time that this vast, it's 19,000 acres, the site of the airport, and it was completely incomprehensible to me that this would be entirely, you know, paved over. But, you know, as we all know, over the following years, you know, that was exactly what happened. And there was, you know, there were very strong cases to say that the airport could have gone elsewhere, or could have, that the capacity could have been met by expanding Sabiha Gökçen on the Asian side, by keeping Ataturk. But, you know, the subtext of this project was that by developing this area, it would unleash, you know, a huge amount of surrounding land for development. And the other story, you know, behind the airport, which is why I found it interesting, was that you know, at the end of 2013, when you had this big row that blew up into the open. Sorry, I realise I'm not looking at any of you. I'm just sort of looking at the screen. So.
And the camera's in the out.
The camera's in the out.
So
No.
Oh, no, it's on my screen.
It's on your screen.
Camera, it's on my screen. Yeah, yeah.
That's not camera.
But when this big row between the AKP and the Gülen movement burst into the open in you know, December 2013, one of the key cases there was about the tender process for the construction of the airport, and was essentially, you know, alleging fairly convincingly that the consortium behind the airport, that one of the companies involved in it, had been given their share in the consortium in exchange for buying a struggling media company, Sabah TV, which at that time was on the market, or was going to be sold, possibly to Rupert Murdoch. And obviously Erdogan didn't want a very important big media asset falling into foreign hands. So he said, if you buy this struggling media asset, then we'll let you in on the airport consortium. So you know, it very powerfully showed the way in which politics and construction are sort of, you know, or rather the construction industry is leveraged to serve, you know, political ends. Finally, the other thing which struck me about the airport is that now I use it and I go through it, and you know, it's generally, if you look online, it has good reviews. A lot of people say, oh, I quite like it. I mean, it's very big. It takes half an hour to get anywhere. But I'm sort of surprised even myself by how I come to accept this place as the sort of gateway through which I come into Istanbul, and just the way in which, you know, we as people become so rapidly acclimatized to changes which initially seem terrifying and dramatic. One of the, you know, the next sort of big formative event which I write about in some detail in the book is the coup attempt of 2016, which for me it was a sort of strikingly similar in certain way to the Gezi Park protest. And I remember very clearly Erdogan arriving back after the coup attempt had been thwarted, arriving back into Ataturk Airport, just as he had arrived back into Ataturk Airport at the height of the Gezi protests, and making this speech, which was kind of chilling almost as much for the crowd and what the crowd was shouting as much as for what he said. And it was this sense that you had of Turkey heading down a darker path, and so, you know, I wrote about the coup attempt and the role of the sort of, I guess, the phenomenon of the Gülenists in Turkish society, because I think they're sort of such an important and now kind of slightly under discussed aspect of Turkey's recent political history, in terms of, you know, the role they played in getting Turkey to where it is today. And so in the book, I look at the Gulenists and the coup attempt from various angles. I mean, one of the characters who I write about was a student in a Gulenist dorm, and she was sort of, they tried to sort of indoctrinate her, but she sort of reacted against it. And one of the other characters is the wife of this Gulenist school teacher who died really effectively as a result of torture in the Turkish police, in the main police station at Vatan, on Vatan Caddesi, just near the walls. And then also a police officer who was one of the Ghazis of the night who fought against the soldiers. His sort of experience of seeing them from the inside. I mean, from inside the police, where they were obviously very, very influential at the time. So that's the sort of the perspective one of the decisions I made when choosing who to write about and when finding people to write about for the book was that they wouldn't be famous people. They wouldn't be people who are sort of in the headlines or well known. They would be broadly speaking, sort of ordinary people, and I would try and write about their lives in a broader way than just the events that had made them of interest. So for example, this was so I've got a couple more pictures from the coup. This was this sort of extraordinary moment when Erdogan had rallied people on his phone to resist the coup attempt. I remember that the presenter there was frantically trying to cancel incoming calls while he was making his speech. And then obviously, when the coup was thwarted, you had people whipping the soldiers with their belts on the Bosphorus Bridge. So one of the characters who I write about in the book was also who worked at the airport, worked at the new airport, and he was also a sort of HDP member. So sort of through his story, I then went in to write about the really extraordinary collapse of the situation in the southeast, from having been, on the brink of possibly something quite good, up until 2015, when there were two elections, and then really the resumption of conflict, and then the very sort of bad situation that we have today, where the kind of human rights abuses you're now seeing in the southeast are sort of reminiscent of what was happening, in the 90s, in some regards. So it was actually after. Sorry, I'm going to get back to that one, because it was after the coup attempt that I actually decided to leave Turkey and move to England. And it wasn't really a decision that was I wasn't forced to leave Turkey, and I would never claim I was forced to leave Turkey, but my father-in-law was being prosecuted for comments he'd made or was supposed to have made about the peace process. So he was involved with the Medical Association, which took a very strong stance against the collapse of the Kurdish peace process. And he had, he was in court. We were living with him. It was a very sort of anxious time. I remember, thinking about. I remember throwing out lots of my belongings, a sort of a gas mask that I had from the Gezi protest and all this stuff, and worrying about keeping my computer at home in case the house was raided. And I just got married at the time, and my wife and I sort of decided to move to England. And so the bulk of writing the book took place, when I was in England, sort of making trips back, which created a slightly unusual perspective. And I continually felt while I was writing the book that I was losing touch with Turkey and that I didn't know it as well as I used to. But I would try to sort of console myself by saying that there's also an advantage in distance, and that you know, by being further away from the country, I was no longer so angry, for one thing, and also I was no longer quite so close to the kind of minutiae of the kind of meta debate around all the different subjects and the kind of, you know, what the AKP trolls are saying about this or that. And so I found in some ways it was quite good because it allowed me to sort of, I hope, be more sort of considered in my sort of perspective and attitude towards the people I was writing about and the different issues. So yeah, so then obviously one of the big sort of events that occurred sort of almost as I was finishing the book was the massive earthquake which struck the southeast of the south of Turkey. And earthquakes are actually something which had been a sort of theme in the book because obviously, you know, the history of the walls themselves were very much marked by earthquakes and this continual rebuilding that was required. You know, you had the Marmara earthquake of 1999, which had sort of helped bring Erdogan, which was one of the things that had helped bring Erdogan to power. And then there's the constant spectre of the earthquake, which is sort of looming in Turkey, I mean looming in Istanbul, and obviously the thing I found sort of interesting about earthquakes was that it always seems to me that some of these big pivotal events in Turkish, you know, in Turkey's recent political history, you know, the coup attempt, the Gezi Park protests, and also the 1980 coup, which is something I sort of write about, because I found that all the people I spoke to who were alive at that time had very strong, intense memories of the 1980 coup and the time leading up to that. And so I almost felt that there were these sort of political earthquakes that were also happening in Turkey, and that were kind of, there was this building up of pressure, and then suddenly there was this event that would release things and make everything completely different in the aftermath. And so it turned out that one of the people who I'd been following for about 3 years and writing about was actually from Kahramanmaraş, in the epicenter of the earthquake, and he had lost more than 100 members of his extended family in it. And so you know, I incorporated his story into the book, and you know, I wasn't in Turkey when the earthquake happened, but it was very much something that was that you know, couldn't be ignored, as it were. Anyway, I mean, I think actually going back to that last caption, the guy who I've written about there, you know, I didn't know when I started following these people where their stories were going to lead, and in a way it was sort of deliberate, because I kind of thought I was writing the book over quite a long period, and I thought if I peg it too closely on any individual idea or political event, then you know, I'm going to get made to look silly, because everything changes so quickly in Turkey, and so much happens. What was interesting about this guy is that he was he started out as a very strong AKP supporter. He was a member of the AKP youth arm in Fatih, and really over the course of the time I knew him, he became more and more alienated from the AKP, and actually ended up you know, being a very vocal opponent. And there was an interesting sort of convergence. It was funny because all the way through he was very happy for me to use his name, and then finally at the end he was like, actually, you better not use my name. But there was this funny convergence I found in the stories of the people I told, which gave me a sense of how Erdogan has maintained his political hold on Turkey, and also the kind of weaknesses underlying it. I very much found that the people who I've been following, who were leftists or Kurds or anti-government people in different ways, were either moving abroad or moving out of politics. They would have kids and they would say, "Well, I'm going to step back for a bit," because of the very real penalties that you can suffer as a result of being kind of vocally anti-government in terms of employment and that kind of thing. And then, but there was also this sort of growing disillusion among the more pro-AK people who I knew, where there was this sense that whereas in his early years, I think Erdogan was very good at mobilizing people's passions in a positive way. He had this vision for changing Turkey and for freeing up the restrictions of the secular, secularisms of the secularist era, so, but really that positive vision is increasingly given way to a more negative vision, in which he's basically saying, if we're not here, then things will fall apart. And so I found increasingly that would come into the kind of justifications that people gave for why they still supported him. I remember one person I spoke to said, we're going to vote him in the election because at the end of the day, who do we want sitting opposite Putin? Him or Kılıçdaroğlu. Anyway, so I think I might wind it up quite soon. I'm not sure how long I've spoken for, but it's an hour. I'm sorry, God. I talked for nearly that long. I will. This is the last slide. So and this is the mucilage, which I don't need to say anything to you about. I think it's all fine. But yeah, this is actually the final chapter of the book. Is I go out with a fisherman who was talking about mucilage, and if there's a sort of environmental sort of theme underlying the book, it's I'm interested in the way in which we as human societies try to create these urban spaces. We create these spaces of order around ourselves while simultaneously pushing away the problems that we create on the assumption that they're just going to sort of go somewhere else. And you also see it in the model of urban development in Istanbul, where you have these communities who are sort of undesirable or poor or whatever being pushed to the fringes of the city to create this sort of slightly fake sort of smart centre. And obviously, this is what was done with the Golden Horn in the 1980s. The Golden Horn was disgusting and it was cleaned up, and all the sewage was pumped out into the Marmara Sea, in the belief that it would then flow into the Black Sea and it would all be fine. But that didn't happen, and the pollution was built up in the Marmara Sea, and it gave rise to this terrible problem that there now is there of the mucilage, which is essentially a zooplankton bloom, which then dies off and creates this kind of sludge. Yeah, I'll wind it up there because I've said far too much. I thought I was going to speak for about 45 minutes, and I didn't mean to speak for an hour. So I hope I haven't bored you, and I'll take some questions. I hope it made sense as well. Anyway, so
well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely fascinating, and I've noticed you've used the photographs from the book as well, and they're jolly good photographs, I think. No, absolutely wonderful. Well, I said it at the beginning. I thought I like the book enormously. Yeah, I mean, there's one very interesting thing is that when people go to Istanbul, they tend to get very drawn into the city. It takes over part of their soul. And of course, there's a different dynamic between Istanbul and Ankara vis-a-vis the history of the Republic as well. And you've also absorbed that into your soul. So when I hear you talking about the Republic, I hear you talking typical kind of Istanbul Entel kind of comments on what happened in the early part of the Republic and the later construction of the thing. So you've kind of gone, as it were, native twice over, if you said yeah, and I find that bifurcation between Istanbul ites, if you like, particularly the Anglo-Turkish ones or the westernized Turks in that discourse. Very, very interesting, because it also doesn't really chime into much of the discourse in the rest of Turkey. So, in other words, I find you authentic twice. Let me put it that way.